4 years old, watched by Moscow, ruled by one party. The posters herald a brighter tomorrow, realized by an abundance of smiling workers, happy families, and spacious apartments, and fields overflowing with harvests. Loudspeakers proclaim progress, parades march for unity, and slogans cover the walls like wallpaper. But away from the billboards and the boulevards, the reality is queues for bread, quotas in factories, and whispers silenced by fear. This is East Germany. Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we cover the events of the decade after World War II that brought man from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. I am Sebastian Brandstetter. East Germany, officially the German Democratic Republic, GDR in short, is in its early years, marked by the aftermath of war and division. Since its formation in 1949, the state has pursued an aggressive socialist agenda under the leadership of the Socialist Unity Party, SED, guided by the firm hand of the Soviet Union. The GDR attempts to build a centrally planned economy emphasizing heavy industry, collectivized agriculture, and political conformity. The leaders in East Berlin described this path as the only road to national recovery. Speeches on the radio proclaim the dawn of a new age, where the working class finally holds power and the industry truly serves the people. You hear it in the announcer's confident tone. The new factories are buzzing, the children are strong, and the fields are alive and full of shining tractors. This is the sound of progress, the voice of nation rebuilding. Yet, for ordinary East Germans, these images are far removed from the cold reality of everyday survival. The wreckage of war is more than just physical ruins. It lingers in shortages, the unraveling threads of communal life, and in the deep political mistrust that fractures the nation. Rationing governs food consumption, with families limited in sugar, meat, butter, and even bread. State-run stores, known as Handelsorganisationen, HOs, often present empty shelves, especially in urban centers like East Berlin, with long lines a common sight. Housing also remains a critical problem, with many still living in damaged or overcrowded apartments due to the destruction wrought during World War II, and reconstruction still far behind what's needed. The queues themselves, though, become social spaces, though obviously not by choice. People trade rumors about incoming deliveries. They say the butcher's getting pork tomorrow, while carefully watching for uniformed police or party officials. A mother might clutch her ration card in one hand and a child in the other, hoping that her place in line will yield more than a few potatoes. When the goods arrive, there's often a rush to the counter, a quiet but desperate scramble to secure something, anything, before the shelves are bare again. This scarcity erodes trust, turning neighbors into competitors. In contrast that with the countryside. There, the government's collectivization drive forces independent farmers into agricultural production cooperatives, LPGs. Resistance to collectivization is common, but the state employs taxes, inspections, and political pressure to coerce farmers into joining. Artisans and small traders, likewise, face increased taxation and restrictions as the regime pushes toward a socialist economy. And collectivization does reshape entire villages. Party representatives arrive in dusty government trucks, carrying stacks of forms and lists of required contributions. Farmers who resist are branded kulaks, a word taken from their Soviet masters, also Großgrundbesitzer, large landowners, or, in other words, enemies of progress. Some give in reluctantly, joining the LPGs, but continue to grumble over shared meals or at church gatherings. Others flee westward, abandoning fields that have been in their families perhaps for generations. Old patterns of life, seasonal work rhythms, village fairs, and the autonomy of deciding what to plant are replaced with centrally issued instructions and production targets. While official propaganda celebrates modernization, many farmers sense a loss, both of livelihood and dignity. Industrial workers contend with demanding production quotas, extended work hours, and tight state control over unions. Despite the official rhetoric of building socialism and a brighter future, wages stagnate, consumer goods remain scarce, and workers grow frustrated with their conditions. Inside East Berlin's factories, the air thick with the smell of oil, metal filings, and cigarette smoke, workers operate heavy presses and lathes under the watchful eye of supervisors who report not just on productivity, but also on political reliability. Safety protocols are minimal, but the real danger stems not from machinery, but from surveillance. An ill-timed joke, muttered criticism, or even just mere absence from a political meeting can find its way into an informal report to the authorities. Official union meetings focus less on workers' grievances, which there are a lot of, and more on reiterating party directives, leaving many employees to wonder whether the unions truly represent them at all. While these questions are widespread, dissent is dangerous. The Ministry for State Security, Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, Stasi in short, watches closely for any signs of opposition. The reach of the shield and sword of the party, thus Schild und Schwert der Partei, extends everywhere. In apartment stairwells, the sound of footsteps can prompt whispered conversations to halt mid-sentence. In cafes, one never knows if the man or woman at the next table is simply enjoying a cup of coffee or is listening in as an informant. All the opposition parties have been forced to disband or to join the National Front bloc, which serves as a facade for democratic choice while ensuring SED dominance. Citizens are sometimes forced to denounce one another in the name of safeguarding socialism. The results are devastating. Friends measure every word. Families speak in guarded tones, and even within one's home, the fear of betrayal lingers. Bonds that should offer comfort become fragile, overshadowed by the constant suspicion that anyone, perhaps even a loved one, might be an informant. Against this backdrop, the open border in Berlin becomes an escape route. Each month, thousands cross into West Germany, seeking relief from chronic shortages, political repression, and the ever-present fear of surveillance. This steady flow alarms the SED leadership and their Soviet patrons, who view it as a stark sign that the confidence in the young socialist state is slipping away. Between 1949 and June 1953, around 850,000 people have already left East Germany, headed to the West. The movement across the sector border is steady and quiet, but the effect is visible. A skilled machinist fails up to show at his shift. A doctor's practice suddenly closes. A young family's apartment stands empty overnight. These departures are more than a nuisance, they are a hemorrhage of talent and labor the GDR can ill afford. In speeches, officials decry the lure of capitalist decadence, but in private meetings, they acknowledge the danger. If too many leave, the very system itself may falter and ultimately collapse. As we have covered before, the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 triggers uncertainty across the Soviet bloc. To know more, check out our episode about Stalin's death right here on the TimeGhost channel. Now, in East Germany, the new leaders in Moscow signal shifts in policy, encouraging satellite states like the GDR to soften hardline measures and improve living conditions. For the GDR, this means a partial reversal of the harshest economic and political policies. In the weeks after Stalin's funeral, East German leaders receive a series of pointed suggestions from Moscow. Ease up on forced collectivization, temper the political trials, and address public discontent before it boils over. Walter Ulbricht, the GDR's stern and uncompromising leader, is reluctant to appear weak, but the Soviet advice carries weight. Party communiques begin to use softer language, emphasizing listening to the people and strengthening socialist unity, though few believe the change is heartfelt. By June 1953, the East German leadership announces a neuer Kurs, a new course, a policy aimed at addressing grievances and calming potential unrest. The government publicly acknowledges mistakes, promising relief in rationing, taxation, and political treatment. Concrete steps follow. Ration cards are reissued, prices on select goods lowered, and the heavy hand of the tax collectors temporarily withdrawn from small farmers and traders. Moreover, social insurance requirements are eased, transport fares reduced, and even the return of certain businesses and properties is promised, all calculated to calm unrest and restore a measure of public goodwill. Rudolf Herrnstadt, one of the key politicians of East Germany, explains, "The party must have the courage to admit its errors and to take the people's concerns seriously. Only through honest self-criticism and real improvements can socialism succeed." The announcement and other similar ones spark cautious optimism in some quarters. In towns and villages, people exchange hopeful remarks about the possibility of more food and fewer taxes. Newspapers print lists of reforms alongside photographs of smiling families. Yet there also remains plenty of skepticism. Years of broken promises have left many wary, and for workers in the industrial centers, any optimism is further tempered by jarring contradictions. While the state offers concessions, it simultaneously insists on raising work quotas by 10%. This demand for increased productivity without increasing pay naturally ignites tensions, especially in construction and heavy industry. The quota increase is a blunt reminder of where priorities lie. For the men and women laboring on Stalinallee, the Grand Boulevard of East Berlin, and a display of the GDR's socialist ambitions, it means hauling more bricks, mixing more concrete, and laying more meters of stone each day, all while their own pantries remain half empty. The government phrases the increase as necessary for the progress of socialism due to an economic crisis, but on the shop floors and construction sites, it is heard as work harder for nothing. Unsurprisingly, resentment grows. On the morning of June 16, 1953, the construction workers along the boulevard, Stalinallee, make their move. For weeks, they have labored under the new burden of the quotas. They are tasked with building monumental apartment blocks, meant to symbolize the superiority of socialism. The day begins like many others. The rumble of cement mixers, the clang of scaffolding, the sharp calls of foremen echoing against the facades. But the air is different. It's tense, it's charged. Men and women talk in low voices during their first break, exchanging glances as if weighing an unspoken decision. Then, finally, tools are set down, hammers hang idle, and voices grow louder. The murmurs soon solidify into a shared intent. Enough is enough. The strike quietly spreads from one construction site to another. The sound of work fades, replaced by the shuffle of boots and the hum of urgent conversation. Word spreads rapidly, and the striking workers decide to march toward the House of Ministries to voice their demands directly. They carry petitions demanding the rescission of the increased norms and improvements in their living conditions. The march begins as a column of determined workers moving through the broad streets of East Berlin, but it grows with each block. Passers-by pause to watch, some joining in, others shouting encouragement from the sidewalks. Tram drivers lean from their cab to see what's happening, their passengers even disembarking to follow the growing crowd. The rhythm of boots on the pavement becomes a drumbeat of defiance. One of the protesters says, "We're building palaces here, but we live in ruins. Down with the norm increases." Soon the march gains even more momentum. Other construction crews join the demonstration, followed by workers from nearby factories and from the transport sector. By midday, thousands fill the streets of East Berlin, chanting slogans such as "Down with the 10% norm increase" and "We demand fair wages and work conditions." The mood is tense yet hopeful. For many, this is the first time they have openly challenged state policy. Some carry hastily painted signs, others hold nothing but their ration books up high, a silent display of the shortages. News of the strike and march quickly spread beyond Berlin. Workers in factories, shipyards, and power plants hear of the protest and begin to stop working in kind. The fire spreads. In Leipzig, metal workers leave their machines. In Halle, chemical plant workers lay down tools. In Magdeburg, in Dresden, and elsewhere. Everywhere, the workers clearly show one thing: enough is enough. Soon, towns and cities across the GDR, from Görlitz to Jena, report growing unrest. Radios hum in apartments with whispered accounts of marches in far-off cities, passed from neighbor to neighbor like contraband. By the evening of June 16th, the scope of the protests becomes clear to the authorities. A at first isolated fire in the city of Berlin has grown into a potentially country-spanning inferno. The demands are also no longer solely about quotas, but expand to political calls, free elections, the release of political prisoners, and even the desire for German unity. The streets of Berlin are alive with chants and banners. The crowds gather on Alexanderplatz, Potsdamer Platz, and unter den Linden, the symbolic heart of the city. A mood has shifted. It is no longer a wage protest, now it has become a political uprising. The East German government responds with urgency and alarm. It publishes statements branding the protests as fascist provocations, orchestrated by Western agents and reactionary forces seeking to undermine socialism. But it also makes concessions. By evening on the 16th, the 10% quote hike is rescinded, not that it has the desired effect. The official narrative attempts to delegitimize the unrest, casting it as an external interference rather than expression of genuine internal public dissatisfaction. Loudspeakers mounted on trucks soon patrol on the streets, blaring warnings and urging workers to return to their post. June 17th arrives with a brittle and heavy atmosphere. The official SED statement is clear. The fascist provocateurs and their imperialist backers have attempted to disrupt the peaceful construction of socialism in the GDR. Their actions serve only the warmongers in Bonn and Washington. Yet, undeterred by the show of force, people gather again, in alleys, boulevards, on squares. Their numbers quickly swell, first into the tens, then the hundreds of thousands. Demonstrators carry increasingly bold slogans: down with the Soviet occupation, free Germany, workers unite against oppression. The chants echo between the stone buildings, defiant in the face of the soldiers now posted at intersections. Factories and shops are closed in solidarity, paralyzing the city's economic life. Streetcars are halted, their drivers leaning against the empty cars as crowds pass. In some districts, the police are absent, leaving the protesters to occupy public spaces unhindered. In others, tense standoffs between protesters and police occur. The strikes and demonstrations are now spread all over the country, from Rostock to Dresden, from Magdeburg to Potsdam. In Leipzig, the government's declarations also do little to nothing to calm unrest. A general strike halts tram services there. In Halle, workers occupy local party offices. In Berlin and elsewhere, clashes between the protesters and the simply overwhelmed local police and security forces erupt. Government buildings are defaced, and some vehicles are even set ablaze. By 11 in the late morning, Soviet tanks and troops deploy throughout key parts of the city. The presence of armored vehicles in the streets signals the regime's readiness to use force. Maybe it is too late though. All in all, across over 700 cities, towns, and villages in East Germany, upwards of 1 million people air their discontent and frustration, demanding something needs to change. The SED government agrees. Something does need to change. And Soviet military authorities in East Berlin are already prepared for intervention. It comes at 1 p.m. when General Pavel Dibrova, Soviet city commandant in Berlin, declares martial law. Pretty much immediately, Soviet and East German security forces begin their crackdown. Tanks roll into crowds. Troops fire warning shots, and in some cases, with the intent to kill. Shouts turn to screams as people scatter into side streets and alleys. Clouds of dust rise where vehicles crush barricades hastily thrown together from wooden carts and paving stones. Despite the repression, some demonstrators resist. In several locations, the clashes between workers and security forces grow more ferocious. Stones are thrown. In Bitterfeld, a police station is briefly overrun before being violently retaken. Reports of deaths and injuries spread rapidly, increasing tension and fear throughout the country. Parents call their children home. Neighbors lock doors and draw curtains, once more intently listening for the sound of boots on stairs. Soviet troops and East German police sweep through factories, offices, and whole neighborhoods, hunting down those suspected of taking part. In Berlin alone, the Soviets deploy 600 tanks to put down the demonstrators. Interrogations are relentless. Some detainees are released after warnings, while others vanish into prisons without trial. Workplace committees are instructed to identify agitators among their colleagues, often under pressure to produce names. Fear settles over cities like a second occupation. Everybody knows someone who is missing, and no one knows who might be listening. By nightfall, the uprising in East Berlin is broken. The streets that rang with chants in the morning now echo with the rumble of tanks and the bark of military orders. Floodlights sweep across empty squares. The curfew is still in full force. In the following 3 weeks, 10 to 15,000 protesters, or traitors, depending on whom you ask, will be arrested, with at least 55 having died during the protest. The regime moves quickly to reassert its control, but the memory of these 2 days will not fade so easily. The government and Soviet authorities continue to characterize the uprising as a foreign-led conspiracy, dismissing the genuine grievances of the workers. The newspaper Neues Deutschland runs front-page articles praising loyal citizens who stayed at their posts and condemns those misled by fascist agents. Photos of smiling families with party officials aim to override the chaos of the previous days. Among the detainees, many face harsh Stasi interrogations. Trials are often closed, with sentences ranging from long prison terms to death. 7 people are executed, more than 2,000 others are sentenced to long prison sentences, and about 10,000 more lose their job and get blacklisted, some until the 1960s. Workplaces are locked down. Managers are told to tighten discipline, while the FDGB, Freier Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund, the Free German Trade Union Federation, once more becomes an arm of state enforcement. The brief new course shift towards concessions vanishes as the regime moves decisively to suppress dissent once and for all. Walter Ulbricht, the first secretary of the party, again declares, "The events of June 17 were a fascist putsch orchestrated by Adenauer's agents and American spies. The working class has defeated this betrayal." The reaction in the West is immediate but measured. The Allied commandants in Berlin, representing the United States, Britain, and France, issue formal statements denying any involvement in the unrest. They make it clear that no direct support was offered to the protesters, emphasizing their role in maintaining stability in their own sectors. Behind closed doors, however, Western diplomats recognize the political significance of the uprising. Reports from observers in West Berlin highlight the scale of worker participation and the rare open defiance of Soviet power. Intelligence services begin compiling detailed accounts, hoping to use the events in future propaganda and policy planning. In Washington, President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration seizes on the uprising as proof of deep dissatisfaction within the Eastern Bloc. While cautious to avoid direct confrontation, the US government frames the unrest as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of communist rule. On July 10th, Eisenhower offers humanitarian food aid to East Germany, emphasizing its purpose as a relief measure for ordinary citizens rather than a political ploy. As expected, the Soviet Union rejects the offer outright, accusing the United States of using so-called aid as a tool of subversion. However, the refusal does not end the matter. Instead, West Germany and the United States organize an alternative delivery system through West Berlin. Food parcels are distributed to East Berliners who cross the still open sector border, creating a visible and symbolic gesture of Western generosity. Photographs of long queues in West Berlin, with East Germans carrying home bags of flour, sugar, and canned goods, are widely circulated in the Western press. For the GDR leadership, these images are deeply embarrassing, underscoring the shortages and public dissatisfaction they have tried to conceal and deny. Inside the GDR, the uprising is erased from official history. For some, the memory is prideful. For others, a bitter reminder of how quickly hope can die. The Stasi emerges from the crisis stronger than ever, expanding its surveillance network and tightening its grip. Soon, it will speed up new recruitment. The Stasi will become the largest per capita secret police force in history. Internationally, the events reveal both the fragility of Soviet control and the limits of its tolerance for dissent, shaping Cold War policy on both sides. In West Germany, June 17th will become a national day of protest against communist rule and will be observed until German reunification in 1990. Now, a nation stands split in two. One half seemingly prospering under Western democracy, the other locked under draconian measures to preserve its vision of order, progress, and justice. But how long can such a fragile balance last? What if the economy stalls? If the shortages deepen? If the Stasi cannot silence every whisper? And if the people lose their fear? What then? What if Moscow looks away, even for just a moment? What if the figurative Iron Curtain should become a literal wall? For now, the tanks have done their job. But how many more times can they be called? These are not just questions for East Germans in 1953. They are questions for the entire Cold War world. The uprising has shown the cracks in the Iron Curtain, but also its resilience and the price of testing its strength. What comes next will decide the fate of millions. If you want to know more about the Cold War, stay with us on the TimeGhost channel and join the cause on timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Together, let's explore history. Excelsior!